August 31st, 2023, full moon, Lunar Observance Day. It's also a blue moon. So there was a full moon on August 1st, I believe, and then now it's August 31st. So the phrase "once in a blue moon" was coming up in my mind. Also, I think it's a super moon. The moon is the closest to the Earth it's been in a while. So some of the phrase came up: once in a blue moon, wholesome qualities arise. Or once in a blue moon, things go our way. It does happen once in a while, sometimes. And there's environmental factors to how we feel, to how we're doing. Sometimes, like full moon, I've heard that full moon, that's in emergency rooms, it's kind of like clockwork. Like a full moon, there'll be more people going to the ER. The mind can be more kind of unwieldy during the full moon, and then sometimes we'll look at the weather. So there's smoke in the air, so that can make people more irritable and quicker to have kind of knee-jerk reactions to different situations. So that's just an environmental factor, so these conditions do matter. And I think we tend to underestimate how much external conditions have an effect on us. Just something like the full moon, or smoke in the air, or a combination of those two. And we can feel a bit more tense, scattered. I know for me, when there's a lot of smoke in the air, then like the body there's some tension in the body. So these environmental factors, it's just one part of mindfulness, just taking note of environmental factors and just how do they affect us. And if we see that, then it's less likely we're going to take it out on other people. That we can see, oh, it's just these environmental factors, and then we can reflect on it. That, oh yeah, it's just this way. When there's smoke in the air, it feels like this. The experience is like this. When there's a full moon, it feels like this. The experience is like this. When there's a new moon, it's like this. And when it's cloudy, it's like this. When it's sunny, it's like this. And sometimes the mood can be lower when it's cloudy, and a sunny day can cheer us up, brighten the mind. And then sometimes also we can underestimate just our own conditioning, our own upbringing, how much like our parents we are, not just physically, but emotionally. We'll tend to have the same emotional habits, emotional reactions as our parents, and we might not be able to admit that at first, but then over time as we reflect on it, I know for myself, I'm kind of amazed sometimes at how like my parents I am. And yeah, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And we learn these things at a very young age, and it just becomes this ingrained conditioning for us. But if we can see that with mindfulness and know it, then we can work with it. And maybe not get caught up and stuck in the same unwholesome cycles, unwholesome habits that we maybe had before. So this is just practice. This is how we develop our practice. tea time the other day, some people were asking me about what's the experience like of being the abbot of a monastery. And one person asked, like, what type of abbot are you? Do people fear you? And I said, I don't know. I hope not. I'm not sure, though. You never know. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting question. As for myself, just when I ordained, I never really saw myself really as a senior monk or as a teacher or as a abbot of a monastery. So when I was a junior monk, it was just like trying to get by day to day, and didn't really see myself in those roles or those positions. And coming to the monastery more with the intention of, okay, renunciation and not necessarily wanting to be in the public eye, and then how much different it is now as a teacher, being more in the public eye and knowing more people, interacting with more people, a wider variety of people, and giving teachings, giving instruction. Whereas as a junior monk, it's more just trying to practice, trying to do this training, and just going about the lifestyle here day by day. But in more of a private way, I could keep to myself. I could not be seen by the public, and could be more anonymous, and maybe I didn't really have the thoughts like, what does the general public think of me? So that wasn't part of the experience then. The experience then was still kind of learning the ropes, learning how to be a monk, learning about the precepts, and trying this or that in the meditation. And so things change. Now it's different. Now the experience of my life is completely different than it was as a junior monk. And not at all how I imagined it might be. As a junior monk, it's hard to imagine being a senior monk. It just seems so remote, seems so far off. And so now there's a feeling like the stakes are a bit higher. Like, say if I have to give a teaching and I feel tired or don't feel like I want to do it, there's just that sense of duty, so just doing it anyway. And just speaking about whatever is coming up. And sometimes there is that feeling of like, oh yeah, I'm tired, or just there's a lot of smoke in the air, so the mind isn't so clear. And maybe the talk won't be so interesting. And then looking at the mental resistance that's happening to giving a talk, and but then just kind of doing it anyway. And that's what we do in this tradition, in the Luang Por Chah tradition. So we don't. It's like this story of. We could think of this story of Ajahn Sumedho, when Ajahn Chah was having him start to give talks, and giving a talk and talking for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes. And then Ajahn Chah sitting there and, no, keep going. And it's the lunar observance day, so there was maybe a number of people there. And then he has them keep going. Talk gets less interesting. People start leaving. And then he thought, okay, that's enough now. And Ajahn Chah wanted him to keep going, so he kept going. And then that pattern repeated itself a few more times, and after a few hours, there was only one person left in the audience. Everybody else had left. And then he felt a bit more comfortable about giving talks after that it didn't really matter whether it was interesting, or whether there was whether it was profound or not profound. Just, okay, we'll just, whatever's coming up, we just speak in a impromptu way. When we give talks, we don't have notes like a lecture. So I don't know if this would be classed as a lecture, but it's just Dhamma Desana, just a talk about whatever might be useful in the moment. So there's this idea to have a spirit rock retreat next year. Ajahn Amaro invited me to co-teach with him next July, and we'll see if that happens. But I like the proposed theme of it, which is it's the Four Noble Truths. Do they still count? Are they still applicable? So it's like coming back to the basics of the teachings, and this the Four Noble Truths being the first Noble Truth being the truth of suffering, of dukkha, and the second being the cause of dukkha, which is tanha, craving, and the third, which is the cessation of craving, nirodha, and the fourth Noble Truth being the path leading to the cessation of craving. This is something specific to Buddhas, this particular teaching, and something that he realized on the night of his awakening. So, of course, yes, they're always applicable. The Four Noble Truths are always applicable, but sometimes we forget about them, so we have to kind of come back to this, especially the second Noble Truth, that craving is the cause of suffering. So we think of this dissatisfaction, the sense of things aren't quite right with us, and then we look for the mind tends to go out looking for various causes for this, and then trying to remedy those causes. And of course because of ignorance, the mind is very misguided, and we end up doing things that we think are going to lessen our suffering, and they end up compounding it and making it worse. So because we think, okay, well, the Buddha said the cause of suffering is craving, so we have to remind ourselves of that all the time, because what the heart really believes, it doesn't really believe that yet. We haven't trained ourselves, so it doesn't really believe that. What it really believes is, this person is the cause of my suffering. This external situation is the cause of my suffering. That's what I think the cause of suffering is. This person eating too loud is the cause of my suffering. This person who didn't do what I asked them to do is the cause of my suffering. This person who criticized me, that criticism is the cause of my suffering. Therefore, I need to seek out situations where I'll only be praised, then I won't suffer. So that's what we really believe deep down inside. That's what the heart really believes, because it's not yet trained. What the heart really believes is that it's following the worldly winds, the worldly dhammas, and getting the worldly dhammas the way we might like them, which is an impossibility. It's an absurdity to actually think that ever could be, but that's where we're at. That's what we're starting with. So it's a radical taking of responsibility to say, me wanting things to be other than what they are is the cause of suffering. And it's not just the cause of suffering for me, but it's the cause of suffering for others as well. Because when I have that sense of dissatisfaction with the way things are, then it's inevitable that I'm going to be blaming others, and that's going to be a burden. That's going to create burdens for others as well. So this radical taking of responsibility for the dissatisfaction that we feel, the sense of things aren't quite right that we feel, and when we take responsibility for that, then we can we can build our practice, then we have something to work with. Because if our suffering actually came from outside, there's nothing we can really do about it. We can't just change the world. We can't just go around changing other people. But we can change ourselves. So once we realize, oh, it's coming from the heart, it's coming from inside, this experience is coming from inside, it's not coming from outside, it's the way I'm reacting to these external conditions that is causing this sense of dissatisfaction, lack of contentment, or malcontent. And then realizing that, then it actually empowers us to do something about it. And we can look into it. So this is where the Buddha's teachings come in really helpful. Sila Samadhi Panya. Okay, well, the Buddha said that if we take on precepts and meditate on a daily basis and develop wisdom, then we can start to gain insight into this. We can see it a bit more clearly. And letting go, so we hear this teaching about letting go, and I think of that as skillful response. We actually learn how to skillfully respond to these worldly situations that we come into contact with. When we learn how to skillfully respond, then our suffering can start to become less. But the dukkha can be really strong. And it's kind of we have to develop these other qualities as well of humility and an attitude of just being very humble and being able to admit these things to ourselves. It's actually can be quite difficult to admit that we're suffering. And it's actually quite rare that we open up and admit to ourselves or talk about to others how we're really doing, how we're really feeling. So it just stays locked up inside. And, if we're in the monastery, it's kind of frowned upon to be greedy or angry. So if we experience those states, we might think, well, I don't want anybody to know that I have those states, so we might repress them. And then it kind of spurts out in various ways over time. But repression isn't really what we're looking for, or an expression of our greed or our anger. That's the other extreme. Well, if I express it, it'll make it better. It's certainly not the case either. So Buddhist meditation, what it calls for is neither expressing it nor repressing it, but knowing it with mindfulness, bringing it into consciousness, acknowledging it. This is suffering. And then investigating, where does this come from? But if we don't consider and investigate, and we just continue we might do a lot of sitting meditation, but what kind of meditation are we actually doing? If we have the attitude that if I just sit long enough, something will happen, and we're just waiting for something to happen, that's just not how it works. It's not going to get any better. We actually do have to consider things, look into things. Okay, maybe today I can try focusing on the breath. How does that work? This is also the 4 Adipatas, the Chandavirya, Chittavimamsa, the 4 bases of success. Can we be applying those to our practice all the time? Chanda meaning desire. We have to want to make progress. We have to want to develop wholesome qualities. That's chanda, virya, putting some effort into it, applying effort, actually making the effort to sit, making the effort to walk. Chitta, putting our heart into it, application of mind. Vimamsa, reviewing. Did it work? What was the result of that practice? What was the result of that action? So using chanda, virya, chitta, vimamsa to actually take stock of things and how are we developing? And sometimes when we might feel like, there's so much work here and there's so much activity and so much happening. I just wish I could just take a rest. I just wish I could just take a 2-week retreat, a 3-week retreat, a 4-week retreat. But then we do that, and how does it go? How do we feel at the end of it? Is it any better? Sometimes if we go into a retreat with that attitude, at the end of it, it's like, well, is it any better? How did it go? That's vimamsa. That's the reviewing. I went and took a rest. How did that go? Is the mind bright? Is the mind clear afterwards? Yeah. Or did it not help? Yeah. Chances are it didn't help, but if we don't review, we won't really see what's working, what's not working. Or when I engaged in this or that activity, how did that go? Did it help? Was it good? Or did it cause the mind to just, sink deeper into chaos and confusion? This is also part of the practice that we have to see the asada and the adinava, the asada being the benefit, the adinava being the drawback. The way the mind is just normal. This is how almost everybody is just looking at the gratification in the moment, not really thinking of the result. So, yes, this is good right now. But then the result, is it worth it? So when we start to see the result more clearly, the mind starts to get trained. It's just, okay, every time I do that, I suffer. And is it going to be, part of my mind is saying, well, it's going to be different this time. But then the wisdom comes up to say, no, it's going to be the same every time. Give in to craving, it's going to be the same every time. So not being afraid to use thought to review how are things actually going. How are these current environmental factors affecting me? What is this development of mindfulness? How can I apply myself to it in a way that helps lessen the craving, helps to go against the craving which is causing suffering? How can I see that more clearly? How can I develop goodwill for myself? And whatever practices I've been doing to develop goodwill for myself, are they working, or do I need to adjust them? So these are just some ideas or thoughts about how to further consider developing the practice, reviewing, looking into environmental factors, and seeing how are things actually going, looking into those Four Noble Truths, not letting them fall by the wayside, craving, coming from the inside. It's not coming from the outside. And looking into this dukkha, how can we gain insight into it? So also we're, just as a brief note at the end, we're preparing to go on our annual, what used to be our annual wilderness trip, where we go to Yosemite for 6 nights of camping and practicing our forest tradition skills of setting up tents and glots, living outside. And we've haven't done this in the past few years. It's been a little bit disjointed how we've done this wilderness trip, but it hasn't really been the Yosemite trip as we did it in the past. So yes, looking forward to that. We'll be taking off tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. is the plan, and 9 of us heading out. So yeah, looking forward to practicing more in that, in a different environment for a little bit of time. That's also part of our training, how to be open, how to be resourceful. There's wilderness bhikkhu protocols that we study. If anybody's interested, they can look into Buddhist Monastic Code 2. I think it's chapter 14. That there's these different protocols that wilderness bhikkhus are supposed to know. So this is part of our Vinaya study as well that we're doing during the Vasa. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit worn out today, so I think I'll just leave it there for this evening.